Hello, I'm with Randy Wray. He's a professor of economics at the University of Missouri at Kansas City and a senior director at the Levy Institute at Bard College. And I guess by way of personal confession, he's also a very good friend of mine. So, Randy, thank you for agreeing to be interviewed by us.
Thanks.
We both were at a workshop earlier this week talking about the internationalization of the renminbi. What I was struck by was the idea that this was inevitable and that it was also a good thing. And I was wondering, you seem to have some contrary thoughts about that, so I was wondering if you would share that with us.
Well, I think that there will be what I think will be a very long-term evolution of the importance of the RMB in international monetary markets. It's going to increase its importance, and we could envision a day in which the dollar is finally displaced by another currency, perhaps the RMB. But the question is whether you want to push this, and what are the preconditions to moving toward an internationalization of the RMB.
And one of the preconditions that was talked about was capital account liberalization.
Yeah.
And again, there it seems to be this implicit assumption that this is good. I mean, just like financial regulation, deregulation is considered to be a good thing. And both you and I were querying that assumption, and we met with some resistance, as I recall. So.
Yeah. Well, why do you want to open up your capital markets, especially now, after all of the the mess that we've been through in the last half dozen years? Open up the economy to what have been called financial weapons of mass destruction. Why do you want to open your economy to that?
In fact, I can't think of any example of a country which has liberalized its capital account since the Second World War and has actually achieved greater economic success because of that. In fact, just the opposite, I would say.
Yeah. That sounds right to me.
I mean, I'm trying to think of an example. There isn't one. I mean, arguably, the problems in Japan, the foundations of its bubble were laid when they started their capital account liberalization, and then the yen started its appreciation as a result of that. So.
Yeah, people say they're amazed that China and some other countries recovered so quickly from the crisis and began to grow very rapidly again. It's not hard to figure this out at all. They had not allowed Wall Street and the international financial institutions into the economy. The financial sector is still fairly tightly controlled, and I think that this is probably a good thing.
And now you've also written about this in the context of the U.S. When we used to control our financial system at a time of what Veblen called managerial capitalism, and since that time we've moved to what Minsky called money market capitalism. I'm wondering if you want to discuss that evolution a bit and what the impact has been on the U.S.
Yeah, this idea that you need to liberalize finance in order to have decent economic growth and development, it's belied by the facts. The United States' golden period of economic history was a period in which we had greatly downsized finance and very tightly controlled it. It was only when we started releasing finance that our growth suffered. And the financial crises came much more frequently and became more severe until finally we had 2008.
What do you think Minsky would say of the regulatory response, or maybe the lack of it is a better word for it, since the 2008 crisis?
Well, he actually was writing on reformation of the financial system in the early 90s, a series of papers in which he was, he argued that the New Deal constraints had been very effective and very useful for the time. He didn't believe we could just go right back and reinstitute Glass-Steagall the way that it had been set up in the 1930s. He thought we would need new kinds of regulations and rules, but he definitely was concerned that we had just released finance and that we had the growth of what he was calling money manager capitalism, a very unstable form of capitalism that did look a lot like financial capitalism of the 1920s, which crashed, and he said failed, and we got rid of it. I think that we crashed again in 2008 in the same way that we had crashed in 1929, and rather than getting rid of that very dangerous form of capitalism, we tried to prop it up.
And in fact, there's a lot of parallels between the two periods because, as you pointed out, the so-called FIRE sector, finance, insurance, real estate, profits as a percentage of total American profitability, I think were as high as 40%, 42% in 2006. And the last time we were at that level, again, surprise, surprise, the 1920s.
Yeah, and we're back there.
And we're back there again, and so nothing's really been done. That's the difference. I mean, in the 1930s, we obviously did curb finance. I guess one of the differences was we actually shut down the banks. I mean, that were actually insolvent, whereas this time we've just propped them up through a number of alphabet-type TARP programs that sustain zombie banks.
In a way, we made finance almost irrelevant. And then we grew very rapidly. We had our golden period. And see, what people don't understand or they misunderstand, they think finance is a scarce resource. Finance is not a scarce resource. We can have as much of it or as little of it as we want. It's a policy decision. And the problem is finding good borrowers. It's the borrowers that are a scarce resource. So what we did was we promoted financialization of the economy. We grew it until it became 20% of value added, 40% of corporate profits. And with the financial sector that big compared to the rest of the economy, the participants have to continually look for areas in which they can make profits. And they should be above average profits, of course.
Now, one of the points you made earlier was the importance of finding a good borrower, and of course, finding a good borrower means finding a creditworthy borrower, and finding a creditworthy borrower means someone who's fully employed and has rising incomes. And you and other Minsky scholars have suggested that the best form of financial stability is to run full employment type policies. And in fact, you've been at the forefront of advocating a so-called job guarantee program. Do you want to describe that for us?
Well, so the fundamental insight is that neither economic growth nor even economic development automatically ensures that you're operating anywhere near full employment. So in at least the past decade, we've had mostly jobless growth. So economies are growing globally, but they're not creating enough jobs. And so we're leaving behind significant parts of the population. And as someone remarked yesterday at the conference here, a big problem in China is that we don't have shared prosperity. So we have prosperity for some, and other parts of the economy, parts of the population are being left behind. So we need to ensure shared prosperity, and the job guarantee is a way to ensure that everyone shares in the prosperity by being able to get meaningful work at a decent wage.
So in effect, though, in contrast to, say, what would happen in the 1930s under the New Deal, this would be a permanent institutional feature of government. So the government would stand in to hire. It would act effectively like an employer of last resort, soaking up workers when private sector unemployment was high, and then letting them be bid back into the private sector as private sector savings preferences change back towards hiring again.
Yeah, Minsky emphasizes that this is not a recession or depression program, which the WPA turned out to be. As the economy recovered, we gradually got rid of these New Deal programs. And the problem is that a capitalist economy tends to approach full employment only at the business cycle peak. And the rest of the time, you have substantial unemployed resources. So the economic thinking has been, you need this reserve army of the unemployed. Why do you need them? To prevent price inflation at the business cycle peaks. So another way of looking at the job guarantee is that it is a buffer stock. It's an employed buffer stock rather than an unemployed buffer stock. And this is good for two reasons. First, it's much better for the people who are left behind by the private sector that are not able to get jobs in the private sector to be employed rather than unemployed, to have gainful employment and decent wages rather than relying on handouts. So this is very important in Minsky's argument. And the second thing is that an employed buffer stock is better than an unemployed buffer stock, because the employed buffer stock is at least maintaining their skills and hopefully actually improving their skills while they're working rather than being unemployed.
And so when people talk about wasteful government programs, I always say that, the waste is creating long-term unemployment and subsidizing that, rather than saying creating a buffer stock of shovel-ready labor, if you want to, for want of a better term.
It's extremely hard to think of anything more wasteful than maintaining 10% of your population unemployed.
And why do you think it is that it gains, there is so much resistance to the program? Is it the sense that this is just a government make-work program? That seems to be the most common criticism I hear of it.
Well, I think there's a lot of ignorance about the New Deal's jobs programs. They were not simply make-work programs. We can still see the fruits of those labors around the United States today in the various public works projects that were left behind and are still in use today, so many years after the Great Depression. And besides, look, as Keynes said, if we rid our mind of all of these false objections to employing people, he said, there's nothing more crazily improbable that it is economically efficient to keep 10% at least of your labor force idle. He said, let's just unleash human initiative, and we will find useful work for people to do.
Let me take it back to China for a minute, because you've actually suggested this program to the Chinese government, and you've also suggested ultimately that they get rid of the currency peg and move to a free-floating exchange rate. Do you want to elaborate on that? Because that's part of the paper that you're preparing right now.
Yeah. Well, eventually China is going to float the currency. The problem with even managed exchange rates, and the problem is even more severe if you peg your exchange rate, is that eventually you can run out of the international currency reserves. China, with $3 trillion and more of international currency reserves, doesn't need to worry about this right now. They can continue to manage their exchange rate for the foreseeable future, but eventually China is most likely going to run current account deficits. They will stop accumulating dollar reserves, and they're going to start to use some of those dollar reserves. So eventually they are going to need to float the exchange rate. And by float, I don't mean free float. No country adopts free float. No country allows markets to completely determine their exchange rates. So I'm talking about allowing it to float, but with some intervention occasionally. You need to do that in order to give you the maximum policy space to use monetary and fiscal policy at home to achieve what we call the public purpose. And full employment is, I think, a very important component of the public purpose.
Because what you talk about is the importance of having a free-floating, non-convertible currency, which in turn gives you full fiscal sovereignty, in contrast to, say, what we have in the European Monetary Union.
Yeah, and we see how well that worked out, which we predicted from the very beginning. We said that essentially we've got every individual member nation is pegging to a foreign currency, the euro. And they gave up their fiscal policy space, and there was no equivalent to Washington to provide the fiscal stimulus that you need.
And we're seeing the effects of that today. Hopefully the Chinese don't follow in their footsteps and take the advice that you've outlined in your paper. So anyway, thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed by us. I pretty enjoyed it.
Thanks.